So, when teaching the 1001 Nights, I sometimes start with a multiple choice quiz game. Offering itself for various uses, this quiz aims above all to make me understand the extent to which the students are or are not acquainted with the general knowledge about the Nights that I take for granted. In other words, and adapting the situation to the terminology of the present general meeting, the students are my sample group of what I might call a lay public, while I would pose as the expert. The short form that I would hand out to the students contains a total of 7 points, 6 of which are questions. The questions are supplied with a choice of 4 possible answers each, and students are advised that one or more of the given choices might apply. For the moment, resisting the temptation to play this game with the present audience, I will simply quote the questions and give the correct answers. Now, it starts with a question: from which geographical region do the tales of the 1001 Nights originate? Choices are India, Iran, China, and Arabia. I would say that besides India, the other 3 would apply. What's the name of the female person, in brackets, the sister or the maid, that is together with storyteller Shahrazad? Options are Dinarzad, Dinarzad, Dunyazad, or Daryazad. Sound pretty familiar, or pretty similar actually. Daryazad is the one that does not fit. All the other 3 ones fit in different versions of the manuscripts. How many tales did the original collection contain? Choices are 100, 200, 500, or 1001. I would opt for 200 as the only sort of correct answer. To which century does the oldest preserved manuscript of the Nights date? Choices are 9th century, 11th century, 15th century, 18th century. Choices, well, you could pick 9th century for the oldest fragmentary manuscript, and you could take 15th century for the oldest substantial fragmentary manuscript. The other 2 would not apply. Why does Scheherazade tell the tales? Choices are out of boredom. Well, some people would cross that. You'd be astonished. To satisfy the curiosity of her sister. 3rd, because she wants to reform the murderous ruler. Or 4th choice, for money. I would say that 1 and 4 is wrong. 2 and 3 could apply. And the last question: into which European language were the tales first translated? German, English, French, or Russian? French is the only correct answer. Now, the first point on my form, instead of asking a question, invites the students to name a maximum of 5 stories from the Nights they might remember. The result of the short quiz is little surprising. It usually combines a wide range of vague guesses, some of them close to actual knowledge, with a few informed and/or correct answers given. In particular, the response to the initially placed invitation to name stories from the Nights is telling, since this response, with an overwhelming majority, regularly includes the triad of usual suspects, the stories of Aladdin, Ali Baba, and Sindbad. And yet, as some of you, or most of you might know, in terms of belonging to the quote-unquote original version of the Nights, these tales are as innocent as are the usual suspects that Captain Louis Renault orders to find up in the final scene of the film we all know and love, the immortally romantic 1942 movie Casablanca. Now, I have some general points I want to stress. Before proceeding, let me first state clearly that I will be using the terms expert and lay public for the simple reason of adjusting to the terminology of this meeting. Actually, I'm not particularly happy with positing a clear dichotomy between different groups of people in terms of knowledge. Experts are non-experts in most fields outside their expertise, and any member of the so-called lay public is bound to be expert in some field or other. So for purely pragmatical reasons, I regard as an expert a person that deals with a specific topic in great detail and sincerity, while my notion of a member of the lay public is someone who largely contents him or herself with relying on somebody else's expertise without necessarily caring to question the presentation in terms of reliability, completeness, or correctness. When conceiving this presentation, I had several points of reference in mind. Who is the lay public I'm talking about, and what exactly is lay knowledge in referring to the 1001 Nights? What is my role as the expert, or what should it be? I admit that as a teacher, I sometimes feel tempted to judge the responses to my questionnaire as too simple or maybe even utterly misinformed. But are they? And even though the responses might be wrong, measured against the specialized knowledge held by the expert, are they not equally right in that they result from a process of learning that, as far as the Nights goes, extends at least over 3 centuries? Against the backdrop of these questions, the present paper is to discuss what kind of knowledge about the genesis, history, and character of the 1001 Nights has been communicated to the public, and who participated in this process. I am particularly concerned with the problems the experts might encounter when aiming to convey their detailed understanding of the complex facts to the lay public, and maybe, considering the frustrations involved in the difficult and tedious process of conveying the message, I sometimes feel tempted to wonder why I should bother at all. Now, I have a few thoughts about what I call the agenda of complexity and diversity. So let me sketch this concern from yet another angle. Last year, when reading the exhibition labels during visits to ethnographical and art museums in the Boston and Cambridge, Massachusetts area, I was struck by the frequent use of these 2 terms, complexity and diversity. These terms appeared so often that they would not fail to catch a reader's attention. Summing up the results of recent studies, the labels would repeatedly refer to a hitherto not apprehended or not fully understood so-called complexity and diversity of the exhibited artifacts and the connected cultural background. In contemporary ethnography, both terms belong to the register of truisms. But what struck me was the fact that in the exhibition labels, the complexity and diversity alone appeared to constitute an astonishing and valuable finding, a point that in itself was considered so important that it would not need to be substantiated with any details. It was as if earlier researchers had originally thought of the studied phenomena as something fairly simple and obvious, only to find out later that they were actually much more sophisticated, in other words, complex and diverse, than they had appeared at first sight. Now, being German and not visiting the States so often, I'm not in a position to judge whether the repeated use of the 2 terms is probably just a typical case of Harvard jargon. Yet the 2 terms serve quite precisely to nail down my problem. The problem I'm concerned with here, that is how to convey the complexity and diversity of the 1001 Nights as the world's most famous collection of stories to the general public, a public that for the simple reason of adjusting to the terminology of the present meeting, I consider as the lay public. So before proceeding to a more detailed argument, let me now first sketch what I consider as general, or at least generally available, knowledge about the Nights. And this is the point where I was going to say that those of you who consider themselves experts about the Nights can now doze off for the coming 12 to 15 minutes, because this is general knowledge. But I hope, those of you who are going to doze off, I'm going to wake up in a moment. Basic facts about the history of the 1001 Nights. In the year 2004, the UNESCO celebrated the tercentenary of the first European translation of the 1001 Nights. This translation, or rather adaptation, was prepared by French Orientalist scholar Antoine Galland. Its first volume, out of a total of 12 volumes to appear, was published in 1704. By including the 1001 Nights in its list of celebrations, the UNESCO honored a literary work that has contributed like no other to the constitution of Western culture, except, one might say, for the Bible. That notably is also a work of Near Eastern literature. The tremendous success of the Nights is documented in innumerable reprints, translations, and selections. By way of imitations, adaptations, and works inspired by single stories, the Nights have become an important constituent of world literature. As a highly influential contribution of the Orient to world culture, they have moreover served as a source of inspiration for numerous works of creative fantasy, above all in the areas of painting, dance, opera, drama, pantomime, music, architecture, and film. Since the Nights and their worldwide appreciation employ the quote-unquote Orient as a matrix of Western imagination, the work has also contributed to the creation of a world view that, through the often discussed publications of Palestinian-American historian of literature Edward Said, has become widely known under the label of Orientalism, a world view that Said has seen as the basis of colonial exploitation and imperial hegemony. And finally, by way of some of the most popular stories included in the Nights, several of their scenes, images, and motifs have become an inseparable constituent of Western imagery. Here we should mention at least the flying carpet, the genie that is imprisoned in a bottle and when released will fulfill the liberator's wishes, and of course the number 1001 as a proverbial expression of infinity. Since more than 3 centuries, the Western reception of the Nights thus expresses the attractive, fascinating side of Oriental culture, serving as the quintessential icon of a carefree and joyful life, as is often said, as in A Tale of the 1001 Nights. And even the recently changing notions of worldwide attention triggered by such phenomena as violent Islamist activities and terrorism of the Al-Qaeda format have not succeeded in irritating the longing of average readers for the eternal splendor and boundless beauty of the Nights. What is this work that has evoked such a dramatic international impact? What are the main characteristics of the conglomerate of stories that serve the female narrator Shahrazad to attract the cruel ruler's attention and fascinate him over a period of 1001 nights, that is, for almost 3 years? What are the roots of this collection of tales, and how has it developed into the monument of transnational narrative that we perceive today? Now, the ultimate origin of the Nights is obscured by history. Research has variously argued for an Indian or an Iranian origin. Textual evidence has been taken to argue for the collection's Indian origin, or to be more specific, for the Indian origin of single elements of the collection's constitutive frame tale. A commentary to the Holy Scriptures of the Jains mentions a tale in which a royal concubine tells a story or a riddle to the ruler for several nights, usually delaying the story's ending to the following night. Shahrazad's action in the Nights thus echoes an ancient stratagem. Moreover, 2 of the shorter narratives included in the frame tale of the Nights possess an analogy in Indian literature. One is the story of the demon who keeps his human wife imprisoned in a chest, a fact that does not prevent her from having sex with innumerable men. And the other is the story of the man who understands the language of animals. One of the main obstacles in determining the relation of these texts to the later versions in the Nights is, however, the difficulty of dating early Indian literature. As for the collection's presumed Iranian origin, 2 short passages in 10th century Arabic sources play a decisive role. More or less agreeing with each other, the Arab historian al-Mas'udi, who died in 956, and Baghdad bookseller Ibn al-Nadim, who died in 995, mention a Persian book named Hezar Afsan, a title that can be translated as 1,000 Wonderful Stories. The book's title in Arabic translation is given as Alf-Khurafa, more or less the same meaning, and it is quoted to be known as Alf Layla, 1,000 Nights, probably, but not necessarily, indicating that originally the number of narrated tales was identical to the number of nights. The collection's frame tale, as sketched by Ibn al-Nadim, is identical to that of the later Nights as we know the work today, And Ibn al-Nadim also mentions a period of 1,000 nights of storytelling. The collection's Iranian origin is corroborated by the fact that its frame tale clearly mirrors an Iranian context. King Shahryar, whose name means hero, belongs to the Sasanian dynasty, the last pre-Islamic Iranian dynasty that was vanquished by the Arabs in the 7th century. Shahryar's brother, Shah Zaman, whose name means king of the period, is the ruler of the city of Samarkand in Middle Asia, and also the name of the collection's main narrator, that is the vizier's daughter Shahrazad, is Iranian, meaning of noble appearance or ancestry. The oldest preserved document testifying to the collection's existence is a paper fragment whose original writing has convincingly been argued to predate the year 879. The fragment's first page clearly shows the title Kitab Hadith Alf Layla, a book of narratives of 1,000 nights. And its second page contains the beginning of the well-known frame tale in which the unnamed narrator's servant, or in later versions the narrator's sister, asks her to tell some tales. Relying on additional evidence from a variety of sources, the early textual history of the Nights has been reconstructed as follows. An originally Persian work was translated into an Islamicized Arabic version before the 8th century CE, integrating narrative material from various other works. By the 12th century, the work had acquired the title Alf Layla wa Layla, 1,001 Nights, or 1,000 Nights and a Nights to be exact, as documented in a note written by a Jewish bookseller in Cairo, who lent the book to one of his customers around the year 1150. Somewhat later, the History of Egypt, compiled by a certain Muhammad ibn Sa'ad al-Qurti, mentions the collection's popularity in Mamluk Egypt. While we can thus be fairly certain about the book's sheer existence, we do not know much about the actual content of its early version, except for the vague outline in the early paper fragment where they mention, quote, extraordinary examples about cleverness and stupidity, generosity and stinginess, courage and cowardice of men. The content of the Nights only begins to show with the oldest preserved manuscript. By an exceptional stroke of luck, this manuscript is the very one that French Orientalist scholar Galland used for his adapted translation. While the manuscript does not bear a date, its dating can be inferred from secondary evidence, the most important evidence being a coin mentioned in the tale of the Jewish doctor in the cycle of stories connected with this supposedly dead hunchback. This so-called Ashrafi dinar, mentioned in the story, has been issued in the reign of Mamluk Sultan al-Ashraf Saifuddin Barsbai, who ruled from 1422 to 1437, and that later acquired such a great popularity that its name became a generic denomination. Since any text mentioning this Ashrafi dinar as a regularly used coin must have been prepared a considerable time after the coin was issued, the manuscript has been suggested to date from the middle of the 15th century. The Galland manuscript today is preserved in the National Library of France in Paris. It consists of 3 volumes containing the stories up to the beginning of night 282, breaking off in the middle of the story of Qamar az-Zaman and Budur. The manuscript thus consists roughly of a third of the total collection, and besides the beginning of the frame tale, contains a total of 7 stories or cycles of stories. These stories or cycles of stories undoubtedly constitute the core corpus of the Nights, whose oldest parts, according to current research, coincide with the so-called Baghdad period, or more or less the Abbasid dynasty before the 11th century. In particular, the first stories are not told in a linear manner. They rather constitute diligently structured, complex narratives changing between various layers that are in their turn told by different narrators. This characteristic feature relates particularly to the story of the hunchback, with a total of 5 embedded tales. The embedded tale of the barber again, serves as a frame for the separately told tales of the Baba himself and of his 6 brothers. Considering this feature, the Nights present themselves as a story told by an anonymous storyteller, in which Shahrazad tells a story, in which somebody else tells a story that frames the story of yet somebody else. This variety of embedding and embedded tales have contributed to the Nights' attraction for a reading and, of course, a listening public. Both so-called Oriental and Western readers will have been fascinated by the intellectual challenge posed by the collection's complex narrative layering. Besides the old manuscript that served as a basis for Galland, we today know about half a dozen manuscripts that most probably have been compiled before and up to the end of the 17th century. None of these manuscripts is complete, and even the totality of fragments does not allow a clear reconstruction of a standard set of narratives that might have been included in the Arabic manuscripts before the 18th century. Current research unanimously agrees that besides the earlier formative Baghdad period, the so-called Egyptian period, coinciding with Mamluk rule in Egypt, has contributed to the formation of the later repertoire of the Nights. Typical narratives from this Mamluk period are tales of tricksters and thieves, such as the tale of Clever Delilah that is taken to represent the popular culture of the Mamluk period. Now, already this condensed survey of the historical development and repertoire of the Nights indicates an important aspect that has ruled the work's content before and after Galland. The Nights is a work with a flexible repertoire of tales. It has been called a true shapeshifter. Instead of containing a fixed set of narratives, it rather offers a narrative frame that in its own right offers the potential to integrate narratives of the most diverse genres and origins. Consequently, over the centuries, the Nights has integrated a large variety of narratives from just about each and every genre, including epics, tales of magic, religious legends, animals' tales, as well as jokes and anecdotes. The person who discovered the Nights for world literature was French Orientalist scholar Antoine Galland. Galland was born in 1646 in Rollo, a small town in the Picardy in northern France. After studying Oriental languages in Paris, he accompanied the French ambassador to the Sublime Porte in Istanbul in 1670 to 75. Further travels in the Levant followed in 1675 to 76 and again 1679 to 88, offering ample opportunities for Galland to acquire antiques, books and coins for the Royal Library and the Royal Numismatic Collection. Back in France, Galland for some time worked as a private researcher, collaborating with Barthélemy d'Herbelot in the first encyclopedic survey of the Islamic world, the Bibliothèque Orientale, published in 1697. In 1701, Galland was accorded member status in the Académie des Inscriptions, and in 1709, he became a member of the prestigious Collège de France in Paris. During his work with Oriental manuscripts, Galland had learned about the fantastic narratives of Sindbad, who is usually called the sailor. I prefer to call him the seafaring merchant. Motivated by counteracting what Galland perceived as what he calls, quote unquote, the tyranny of the contes de fées, or the tyranny of the fairy stories en vogue in French literary cycles of the period, he had initially intended to publish the Sindbad tales in translation, when at some point he learned about the yet larger collection of similarly fantastic tales that is the 1001 Nights. Following this discovery, Galland delayed his publication until he was able to acquire the 3-volume Syrian manuscript of the said collection in 1701. Some years later, he published the tales contained in that manuscript in a total of 7 volumes, inserting the Sindbad cycle in the 3rd volume. What happened next reads like a detective story of publishing history. After Galland had published the 7th and last volume of his translation, he had run out of material to continue his work. His publisher, on the other hand, felt a strong pressure from the part of the audience to continue the work whose name, after all, appeared to promise a collection of tales covering a total of 1,001 nights. Without Galland's consent, he published the work's 8th volume, containing 1 story translated by Galland from a different manuscript and 2 stories translated by Galland's colleague, French Orientalist scholar François Petit de la Croix, from yet another source, that is, an Ottoman Turkish manuscript that Petit later was to exploit for his publication called 1,001 Days. Galland was so outraged at this transgression that he changed publisher. At the same time, he felt impelled to continue and, in fact, complete his own translation. By coincidence, a talented Oriental narrator came to his rescue. In the house of his friend Paul Lucas, who had earned a reputation as a traveler in Oriental lands, Galland came to know the Syrian Maronite storyteller Hannah Diab. This Hannah narrated to Galland several magic tales whose structure Galland jotted down in his diary. Later, using his notes, Galland reconstructed the tales, albeit to a certain extent to his own liking, and published them in volumes 9 to 12 of his work. For the following reception of the Nights, it is important to see that in particular the tales of Aladdin and the Magic Lamp and Ali Baba and the 40 Thieves derive from Hannah's narration. This means that exactly those tales that in later Western perception were and still are taken to constitute the acme of the Nights never belonged to the collection as represented by pre-Galland Arabic manuscript tradition. Besides their origin from an act of creative storytelling on the part of an quote-unquote Oriental storyteller, we may justly presume that the enthusiastic reception of those tales also owes to Galland's specific wording, as well as to the aesthetic and moral features he integrated into his reworking of the notes taken during Hannah's performance. Though they were presented as an integral part of an quote-unquote authentic Arabic collection, the tales Galland's audience enjoyed were thus only to a limited degree genuine quote-unquote Oriental tales. I think I'm going to do with the quote-unquote for the word Oriental because that is repeated several times. They rather satisfied the audience's expectations of what an Oriental tale should be like in terms of attractive strangeness and subliminal familiarity. To put it in simple words, the audience appreciated familiar narrative concepts in an alien garb. The further history of the reception of the Nights and the work's translations is characterized by a series of similarly peculiar events. Now, even though I have a full hour to talk, time does not really allow me to go into more detail here. Considered together, these events add up to depicting a work that was to a large extent created by its Western reception and the ensuing search for the work's complete manuscripts in the 18th and 19th centuries. The result of this creative reception is the fact that virtually none of the work's numerous manuscripts or text editions in Arabic, as well as none of its translations into languages other than Arabic, are identical in terms of content. Moreover, each and every of the numerous tales added to the core corpus at various stages has its own history and needs to be studied as an individual document of storytelling in its own right. The vast majority of the roughly 500 tales that are today encountered in the totality of different versions of the Nights was integrated into the work in response to the repercussion created by Galland's translation. The overall effect of this creative process is so all-encompassing that considering a tale as part of the 1001 Nights becomes synonymous to assessing Near Eastern storytelling in general. Now, this was the part of general knowledge about the Arabian Nights, and those of you that dozed off, but I don't see many, should get back with us. I have a section on questioning expert knowledge. Considering the fact that the general audience in the West regards the tales of Aladdin and Ali Baba as representative of the Nights, while both of them derive from the individual performance of a Syrian storyteller, it becomes obvious that conveying the complexity of the Nights is a tedious affair. Academics whose professional responsibility is linked to being well versed in producing and accessing knowledge should not find it difficult to inform themselves about the general outlines of the history of the Nights. After all, a substantial amount of reliable information, most of it published in recent years, is available. Comprehensive encyclopedic surveys, for instance, include those in the Oxford Companion to the Fairy Tale, edited by Jack Zipes, in the Encyclopedia of Folk and Fairy Tales, edited by Don Hase, in the third edition of the Encyclopedia of Islam, or for readers with a certain proficiency in Old World languages, in the German language Enzyklopädie des Märchens or Kindlers Literaturlexikon. The Nights, moreover, prides itself with being covered in both a companion by Robert Urban and a 2-volume encyclopedia compiled by myself and my Dutch collaborator Richard van Leeuwen. In addition, about half a dozen of conference proceedings published within the past decade discuss numerous facets of the collection in great detail. As a somewhat extended side remark, I would like to mention that even a large amount of analytical information accessible to the experts does not necessarily prevent them from succumbing to inadequate evaluations or even serious misjudgments. A case in point for the present topic is again the tale of Aladdin. In his diary, Galland has noted the tale's original oral performance by Hannah as taking place on the 5th of May, 1709. The high quality of the published text has, however, led research to suspect the existence of a written Arabic version. Contrary to expectations, we know today that such a written version most probably never existed, whether in Arabic, French, or, for that matter, any other language. But since it was expected to exist, it was eventually produced. A phenomenon that we encounter at various points in the long history of mystifications connected with the Nights. More than a century and a half after Galland's original publication, French Orientalist scholar Hermann Sotenberg published the Arabic text of the Tale of Aladdin that he had located in a manuscript preserved in the National Library of France in Paris. The manuscript's colophon, and here you've got to listen carefully, the manuscript's colophon stated the text to be copied from another manuscript that in its turn was originally compiled in 1703. Even though only a single year, 1703, is clearly earlier than the publication compiled, than the publication of the first volume of Galland's translation in 1704. This fact was taken by research as a clear evidence that the Arabic manuscript contained a fully fledged written version of the Tale of Aladdin, relied on authentic Oriental tradition independent from Galland. Subsequent research soon led to suspect that the Arabic manuscript was nothing but the Arabic translation of Galland's French text, and that the manuscript's dating was, of course, a deliberate deception. Even so, until recently, most researchers preferred to believe in the manuscript's authenticity. Only Mohsen Mahdi, the editor of the Arabic manuscript Galland had used for his translation, convincingly argued that the manuscript was a conscious forgery prepared by Lebanese Michel Sabah, a person who lived from 1775 to 1816 and who towards the beginning of the 19th century was employed as a scribe and caretaker of Arabic manuscripts at the Royal Library. Now, experts are expected to guide non-experts by advising them against the backdrop of their specialized knowledge that, in extension, guarantees or appears to guarantee their superior competence. Yet, as we've all experienced, there are numerous backdrops to the competence of the experts, in particular as for the objectivity of their judgment. Let me point out just 3 of the more common pitfalls of expert knowledge. First, as the quoted example relating to the Tale of Aladdin has just shown, experts might fall victim to deliberate fraud and cleverly disguised attempts of misinformation. Second, and most important, expert knowledge is always linked to a specific time and place. A zeitgeist expressing itself in either particular restrictions or else particular preferences. Though at this point I feel tempted to mention the irresponsibly subjective Huntingtonian concept of clash of civilization, in the present context, it appears more relevant or safer to refer to, say, different attitudes in the translations of the Nights. Various translators have treated the text with decidedly different tendencies. As for the English language translations, the most notable dichotomy is encountered in the versions prepared in the 19th century by Edward William Lane, that's 1839, and Richard Burton, that's 1885. Both of them essentially translated Arabic printed texts. But while Lane is bashfully silent about sexual matters, Burton presents himself as a true erotomaniac. Similar to Lane, yet diametrically opposed, Burton proves to be a child of his day, who reacted to the prudery of the Victorian age by outright provocation. The subjectivity of expert knowledge is also evident in the preferences for certain questions at specific times and, of course, the evident neglect of others. As for the 1001 Nights, little effort has so far been spent in the investigation of the collection's appreciation in the countries and cultures of origin, that is, particularly in the Arabic countries, in Turkey and in Iran. Western experts appear to be quite happy with a small collection of actually derogatory statements on the 1001 Nights and other works of fiction in Arabic literature that begins with the said Ibn al-Nadim's 10th century evaluation of the Nights as, quote, a coarse book without warmth in the telling, unquote. In Western research, the like statements have served as the basis for the general assumption that narrative literature as such is disregarded in the Arab world, a statement which, even though to some extent it might be true, clearly contradicts the overwhelming popularity of narrative literature in the Muslim Near East then and now. The contradictory nature of this hypothesis becomes obvious when one considers the fact that a strictly conservative author, such as the preacher and traditionist Ibn al-Jawzi, who died in 1201, cannot but admit that even an exemplary character, as the Prophet Muhammad, liked to play tricks on his companions, occasionally laughed until his molded teeth showed, and himself narrated the fantastic adventure of Khurafa, a male contemporary that was to become eponymous for the literary genre of Khurafat, that is, fantastic narratives dealing with the supernatural. More recent experts on the Nights have modified the apparent denigration of fictional literature in the Muslim world to relate primarily to intellectuals. But even so, they disregard the strong connection of the Nights to popular storytelling. Moreover, the varying appreciation of the Nights in different cultural contexts may implicitly also be taken to indicate and underline a presumed intellectual superiority of the West. After all, not only was the Nights discovered by a Western scholar who introduced the work to world literature, but it was, moreover, the Western audience who recognized the collection's artistic value and further developed its potential. Now, without intending to open another can of worms at this point, let me just mention that it would certainly be interesting to relate the genesis of the Nights to the concept of cultural property, a concept that is currently being explored in the context of a large research project in my hometown of Göttingen, supervised by colleague Regina Bendix, who is well known in this audience. A third point relating to the reliability of expert knowledge should also not be underestimated. Experts might sometimes feel tempted to demonstrate the relativity of their knowledge by ridiculing their own expertise through the inclusion of outrightly absurd information that might not easily be detected as such by the misinformed or the uninformed. Here, I do not refer to the deliberate decoy or copyright trap known in English as a Mount Weasel. This term, the Mount Weasel, refers to the life and career of purely fictional photographer Lillian Virginia Mount Weasel, who ironically is said to have died 1973, aged 31, as they say, in an explosion while on assignment for Combustibles magazine. Instead, I rather mean fictional entries in trusted reference works, such as the entry on Steinlaus, the stone louse, an insect solely feeding on concrete in the standard German medical dictionary, the Pschyrembel. Or there's an entry on Apudobalia, an entirely fictional ancient sport resembling modern soccer, in the Standard Encyclopedia on Greek and Roman Antiquity, the German language Der Neue Pauli. An entry, Trigant, that has to do with intrigue. In Leander Petzold's Little Dictionary of Demons, an entry that was originally intended to satirize one of the author's former colleagues, but later gained a certain status of authenticity through multiple quotations in the internet. And the discipline of folk narrative research, as some of you know, even possesses a whole monograph study compiled in a similar vein, that is German satirist Hans Traxler's study on the historical facts underlying the story of Hansel and Gretel. According to credible rumors, this work, proposing to establish the new discipline of fairy tale archaeology, at first earned utmost praise even by some renowned contemporary scholars before being disclosed as a cleverly disguised parody of painstaking academic research. And again, the internet has opened up hitherto unimaginable opportunities for creative fantasy in the fields of pseudo-academic nonsense, making fun of the so-called expert knowledge by such quote-unquote content-free encyclopedic ventures. Some of you might know this, the Enzyklopädie, the Stupidedia, or the Camelopedia. Now, before venturing into such serious nonsense areas as the Church of the Flying Spaghetti Monster, equally known as Pastafarianism, let me stop here by simply mentioning that even experts of the 1001 Nights have included similar, yet altogether fairly modest fictional exercises of this kind in their work. A case in point is the tale How Abu Hassan Brake Wind, in Richard Burton's translation, a short scatological tale that tells us how Abu Hassan's tremendous fart during his wedding feast established a new reckoning of time. This tale is not documented in any manuscript of the Nights, and we may presume that the translator inserted it for his own amusement. And to share with you a secret not many people know, even the Arabian Nights Encyclopedia contains an entirely fictional entry, in this case an emotional tribute to the beloved dog belonging to the main editor's wife. Now, I'm not going to tell you which entry this is. You just got to read through the work and find it yourself. Points such as these should lead the interested public to regard so-called expert knowledge with a healthy distrust, or at least to question its objective validity against the backdrop of potential traps. The expertise of the experts does not absolve the responsible audience from forming their own judgment by taking recourse to a variety of opinions, cumbersome and laborious as this process might be. So far as for the experts. But what about the lay audience? Where would they gather their information? The age of the internet has democratized knowledge by its potential to make large amounts of information accessible to the interested public. And to quote one example, incidentally, the first hit in the Google search for 1001 Nights, the Wikipedia entry on the 1001 Nights is actually not bad at all. For those that care to search, the internet, besides numerous fan sites, holds full text editions of the translations by Edward William Lane, Richard Burton, and others. And the online Arabian Nights bibliography offers a comprehensive bibliographical survey of the important monograph and essay studies in the field. Obviously, those that care to be informed should not have great difficulties in accessing reliable information. But then again, who of the general audience actually cares? Without intending to denigrate the general public, I think we may legitimately presume that many, if not most, members of the lay audience would content themselves with the representation of specific problems they are offered, regardless of whether the information be correct and complete, or, on the other hand, tendentious and biased. Already the reception of the tales of Aladdin, Ali Baba, and Sindbad in the 18th century shows that the general audience might be more satisfied seeing its preconceived expectations fulfilled, rather than having to deal with the intricacies of a complex situation, the details of which they might not be interested in. To put it in straightforward terms, who wants to know that the tale of Aladdin does not belong to the pre-Galland Arabic core corpus of the 1001 Nights, and who actually cares? After all, it's a charming tale, attractively told. No, this is not the right pronunciation. Attractively told, yes, more or less. And presenting a fantastically embellished version of the rags to riches concept so well known in European folktales. Should we not consider it a minor and perfectly excusable slip of attention that the tale is considered as the standard representative of Oriental storytelling such as contained in the 1001 Nights? Should we not be more lenient towards the popular misconceptions of the lay public? Now, at this point, let me consider the sources of information about the Nights a non-expert, so to say, lay public might have been or might still be submitted to. Again, it is telling that even while Galland's translation at the beginning of the 18th century was still in the course of publication, the English language Grub Street prints already published single tales in separate cheap booklets, thereby establishing the continuous presence of a highly selective choice of tales from the Nights in popular perception. Not many readers of the subsequent centuries will have ventured to submit themselves to the toilsome exercise of reading the complete Nights, translations of which up to the beginning of the 19th century were exclusively based upon Galland's French version. They would rather have read or listened to selective presentations that in their turn would most often include the said triad of usual suspects, Aladdin, Ali Baba, Sindbad, sometimes together with a few of the more, say, digestible tales, such as those of the Fisherman and the Genie or the Ebony Horse. Without the advent of the new English translations by Lane and Burton, the Nights conquered the stage, and particularly Aladdin was successful in English Christmas pantomime. A major step forward in the popularization of the Nights as the uncritical and uninhibited playground for Western fantasy they were to become was then the invention of the moving images. Ever since Georges Méliès' film Le Palais des Mille et Nuits, The Palace of the 1001 Nights, that's 1905 to 1906, themes and motifs from the Nights have been part and parcel of the international film industry. The flying mechanical horse from the tale of the Ebony Horse and the flying carpet, which incidentally has only a single and rather casual appearance in the Nights, made their first appearance in German director Fritz Lang's film Destiny, Der müde Tod, 1921. Soon after, Douglas Fairbanks, one of the most illustrious and colorful characters of early film business in the United States, produced what he called an Arabian Nights fantasy, the film called The Thief of Baghdad, 1924. This film is an adaptation of the Knight's Tale of Prince Ahmad and the fairy Paribanou, incidentally another tale that had been narrated to Galland by Syrian storyteller Hanna. Fairbanks integrated two motifs he most probably knew from Lang's film, that is, the mechanical horse and the flying carpet. While the mechanical horse moves rather clumsily, the final flight of the film's protagonist, together with his beloved princess above the streets of a Baghdad seamed by high-rise buildings, still today constitutes one of the most spectacular moments of early film history. Serving as a model for numerous later films adapting tales from the Nights to the screen, the influence of Fairbanks' Thief of Baghdad can hardly be overestimated. Through its remake, Thief of Baghdad by Alexander Korda, that's 1939 to 40, it also served as a model for the Disney animated cartoon Aladdin that was first screened in 1992. Another monument of early film history is Lotte Reiniger's silhouette film, Die Abenteuer des Prinzen Ahmed, The Adventures of Prince Ahmed, 1926. The first feature-length film produced solely by animation. This film combines the story of the Ebony Horse with the story of Prince Ahmad and the fairy Paribanou, and also integrates a short version of the tale of Aladdin, here presented as a first-person narrative. Well, reading and listening to the tales from the Nights remained the most powerful ways of transmitting their content and imagery up to and including the 19th century, the effect of visual culture played a similarly decisive role in the 20th century. In contemporary popular culture of the late 20th and early 21st century, the visibility of the Nights has boiled down to a few icons that are exploited in astonishingly well-defined ways. Now, relying on a Google search as the equivalent of fieldwork, we find that the name Aladdin, besides computer security, is particularly notorious for bail bond companies, obviously profiting from the image of releasing the genie imprisoned in the bottle. Ali Baba is often a standard name for Oriental restaurants. Not sure, but there's a sumptuous meal playing a decisive role in the tale's final scene that might have given rise to that notion. And the name of seafaring merchant Sindbad has acquired particular prominence for all kinds of things connected with travel, in particularly travel agencies, and again, particularly travel agencies for single male adults. Regardless of the shortcomings, drawbacks, pitfalls, or other imponderabilities of expert knowledge, and regardless of the preconceptions, biases, and other limitations of lay knowledge on the Nights, there is another important point one has to consider in the present context. The 1001 Nights may allude to a specific notion, but it is not a single book. Each manuscript, each edition of the text, and each translation constitutes separate and at times highly individual versions of a text or single parts of a text. The total of the constituents of this conglomerate adds up to a much more complex phenomenon than any single version contains. Now, let me illustrate the complexity of the Nights with just a few examples from the three areas, or maybe I should say arenas, of manuscripts, editions of the text, and translations. If we talk about manuscripts of the Nights, what's so specific about the Galland manuscript that was edited by Mohsen Mahdi in 1980? How do the manuscripts of the so-called Syrian branch differ from those of the Egyptian branch? I should probably say I'm just giving questions. I'm not giving answers here. What about the alleged Tunisian manuscript that served as the basis of parts of the Breslau edition prepared by Maximilian Habicht, but that in all likeliness constitutes a willful mystification? Should we include in our discussion about manuscripts the late 17th century Ottoman Turkish manuscript that already in Galland's days was preserved in the Royal Library in Paris and that to all appearance furnished some of the inspiration for his adapted translation? What about the early Turkish translations of the Nights, none of which are edited so far, but some of which predate Galland by several centuries, thus in fact alleviating the claim that Galland produced the first ever translation of the Arabic Nights into a language other than Arabic? Should we take into account other anonymous Arabic collections of tales, some of which show a certain overlap with the Nights, such as the North African 101 Nights that are built on a similar frame tale, or the 14th century Istanbul manuscript of a book called Wonderful Stories that contains several tales later encountered in the Nights? And what about the various versions of single tales, such as those of the City of Brass or the Ebony Horse, preserved in other contexts, whether of learned or popular literature? If we talk about editions of the text, why are there two standard editions, such as two standard editions, those of Calcutta and Bulaq, both of which contain more or less identical versions based on manuscripts that to all appearance are not available anymore, so that we are not in a position to judge the impact of editorial decisions taken in regard to content and language? Why does the Beirut edition, even though heavily censored, have its advantages for teaching? Should we also consider the various Arabic texts, like versions of Aladdin and the Wonderful Lamp, that are quite obviously translations from a European language and that are sometimes published in separate booklets, but never as a part of an Arabic edition of the Nights? And finally, if we talk about translations, what is so specific about the Galland translation that only in its first half relies on an Arabic manuscript of the Nights? Why did Lane and Burton in their translations choose to treat morally disputable matters, in particular sexuality, in diametrically opposed ways? How could it be that the Marjorie's translation inspired famous writers like André Gide or Marcel Proust? And why does its English version still today hold a significant position in the book market, even though the original translator took great liberties in including tales from sources that before him had never been connected to the Knights, such as anecdotes from the chapbooks on Turkish trickster Nasreddin Hoxha, or even Egyptian fairy tales collected by Western Orientalist scholars in the 19th century? What exactly is the difference between Hussein Haddawi's translation and other English translations? Why is the German translation by Enno Littmann unanimously praised for its accuracy, while such influential critics as Jorge Luis Borges have characterized it as dull and uninspired? What is the advantage of the new English translation by Malcolm Lyons that, for the first time since Burton, renders the full text of the Calcutta edition in readable modern English, while Ursula Lyons supplied English versions of the original French tales of Aladdin and Ali Baba? And talking about manuscripts, text editions, and translations of the Knights is still only a fraction of the total phenomenon. Particularly when considering the influence and repercussion of the Knights, we have to take into account a tremendous amount of 18th, 19th, and 20th century literature that, to an extent, as Robert Urban has adequately put it, it would in the end be easier to consider those authors of English literature that were not influenced by the Knights. Moreover, what about theater, music, opera, ballet, drama, design, architecture, film, and so on? And what about the repercussion of the Knights beyond the West? The exploration of the Knights as a transnational collection has only just begun, and particularly its repercussion in Ottoman Turkish culture is totally unexplored. As for the popular perception, a wide approach would incorporate more or less the whole area of how the Orient is perceived by the West, either by way of the telling of stories, whether originating from the Orient or whether situated in the Orient in an Orientalist manner practiced in the 1001 Days, or in the fairy tales, say, written by such authors as Wilhelm Hauff. Both solutions have their advantages and drawbacks. While limited studies can only produce limited results, these results would be highly detailed and specific. Wide approaches offer surveys promising a general applicability, but risk imposing expert views that might rather be based on personal views and convictions than being solidly grounded in empirical assessments of the facts concerned. Now, to direct my considerations about expert knowledge versus lay perception of the Knights towards a conclusion, I would like to juxtapose two quotes from widely different yet closely related contexts. The first one is from the introduction to the second edition of Robert Urban's Companion to the Knights, published in 2004. That's a lengthy quotation. Years ago, Urban remembers, I used to play on a classic Williams pinball machine, Tales of the Arabian Nights. As I fired off one silver ball after the other, I would gaze at the filmic iconography of the Arabian Nights spread out on the machine's gaudily painted playbar. That iconography, divorced and free-floating from particular stories, will register with people who have never opened the Book of the Knights. The Rock's giant egg, harem girls in diaphanous trousers, hook-nosed men wielding scimitars, genies, minarets, the Cyclops, the prince disguised as a beggar, the basket full of serpents, the rope which turns into a ladder, the all-seeing eye. This visual clutter of Oriental knickknacks can be put to any purpose. In the West today, the Knights chiefly serves as a kind of reservoir of images and story fragments that can be recycled in films for juvenile audiences. End of quote. He goes on to say, in modern times, in both the West and the Arab world, the magnificent cultural riches of the Arabian Nights have been reduced to a scant handful of cliched and kitsch-laden images. End of quote. The second quote is from a recent interview with Jack Shaheen. author of the groundbreaking work Real Bad Arabs, and that real is with a double E, How Hollywood Vilifies a People. That's 2001 with a revised edition in 2009. And he's done another work called Guilty, Hollywood's Verdict on Arabs After 9/11, published in 2008. And this Jack Shaheen is also a winner of the American Arab Anti-Discrimination Committee's Lifetime Achievement Award. Commenting on the current national conversation on the Park 51 Islamic Community Center, Shaheen points out that anti-Muslim feelings in the US, quote, existed long before September 11, 2001. It's escalated after 9/11, and there are several reasons why it has escalated. One is the fact that we failed to distinguish between the 19 non-American Arab Muslim terrorists and the 7+ million American Muslims that had nothing to do with 9/11. Nobody talks about that, and nobody talks about this not being an act of domestic terrorism. The destruction that took place was not committed by American Muslims, so why are we condemning and attacking them? End of quote. Later, Shaheen mentions that, quote again, in 2008, there were 28 million copies of one of the most racist documentaries ever made. It was called Obsession, and it essentially vilified all things Islam. The major newspaper chains, such as the New York Times, inserted into their newspapers this hateful DVD, giving the impression to some readers that the newspapers actually supported the theme of this documentary. Would any of these newspapers have distributed a hate documentary targeting Christianity, Judaism, or any other faith? End of quote. Now, to my notion, these two quotes illustrate two sides of the same coin. The Western perception of the Muslim world has long been dominated by stereotypical notions of the East as essential paradise, most aptly expressed in the notion of the Arabian Nights. In recent times, this image is tainted by partial and biased notions of the Muslim world as the ultimate harbor of universal terrorism that is particularly opposed to the basic values defining the West, such as the freedom of speech and democracy. Needless to say that both views are equally simplistic in disregarding the complexity and diversity of the phenomena concerned. Both views single out specific aspects of the phenomena and posit those aspects as the essentials while consciously disregarding or suppressing others. The devastating effect of this simplification can be demonstrated by a chain of misperceptions in such widely acclaimed productions as the animated cartoon Aladdin, again, 1992. To the uninformed spectator, the Disney studio version is representative of the tale of Aladdin. That, again, is taken to constitute the quintessential tale of the Arabian Nights. Now, for centuries, the Arabian Nights have been seen as an authentic product of Arabic Islamic culture, so that in the end, the cartoon risks being understood as representing Arabic Islamic culture. Today's perception of the Muslim world works in similar ways. Here, the action of a small but highly organized terrorist group cynically arguing with the core values of Islam is taken as representative for the whole of the Islamic community. Rather than striving to assess, understand, and eventually counterbalance the complex factors that nourished radical Islam and that led to the establishment of the terrorist groups, public opinion ever so often prefers to succumb to the temptation of perceiving them as a kind of vermin, the only treatment for which is physical annihilation. Simplification, or maybe one should say oversimplification, is a road to bias. And bias might easily lead to denigration, contempt, and violent conflict. For the purpose of my presentation, disregarding or neglecting the fact that Muslim terrorists are not representative of Islam as a whole is equal to regarding the world of the 1001 Nights as a legitimate playground for Western fantasy, while disregarding their highly complex and diverse character. An uncritical appraisal is as dangerous as an uncritical vilification, and might equally easily serve as a cornerstone for racism. The experts, whether those of Islam or those of 1001 Nights, hold the key to preventing this solidification and further growth of biased notion. The lay public, that for various reasons is rarely in a position to deal with the complexity of the related phenomena in due detail, needs constant education and guidance based on thoroughly detailed expertise that is acquired by an unconditioned and unbiased quest for knowledge. Now, let me conclude my considerations with something I would call a short mission statement. The 1001 Nights is undoubtedly a highly influential collection of narratives. Narratives, in their turn, are an essential component of human communication. Though they might appear simple in terms of language or content, they are, as we know, neither innocent nor free from the potential of doing harm. Considering these basic facts, the disciplines of folklore and folk narrative research hold a highly responsible position that should, must, and I trust, given our continuous effort, certainly will be duly acknowledged in the future. Thank you very much.